decision?
There and the impact that any reduction will have, because it will. This is a consultation, and in agreeing to the consultation on a block transfer of Schools Forum, our members were very clear that the full impact of any transfer on the budget needs to be shown, and that's why it was included within the consultation. Also, in last year's consultation responses, there were a significant number of schools that responded that the financial impact on schools of that 1% transfer was too significant. And so that was really important that we acknowledged that. But the responses also raised a concern that if the transfer that impacted on NFF rates was made, so to go to that 1%, this would impact disproportionately on those schools that were funded according to the NFF, rather than the minimum per pupil funding levels. So as a result of that, in the interest of transparency, the decision was made that in the 26-27 consultation, Schools Forum members asked that we would include a question on whether the NPPFL level should be disapplied, so that all schools would contribute if a transfer were made. And the big thing there, I think, is should that transfer be made? So it's the if you like. Schools Forum was very mindful that permission for this cannot be made retrospectively. We can't seek that permission retrospectively, and therefore schools needed to be consulted on all those possible options up front and ahead of the process going to the Secretary of State. So for clarity, the consultation question will be worded to make clear that the request would only be made if the council was also submitting a request for block transfer greater than that 0.5%, as you stated right at the beginning. So we need to make sure that that consultation is worded appropriately so that everybody understands the thinking behind that. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, for clarity, what's actually been said there is it's the schools that are requesting that question is asked, and not the council at this stage that is asked for that. That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I now understand.
Great, thank you. And it's always useful to clarify, because it is quite complicated, yes. And some of us have lived and breathed the transfers for a long time, so it's always useful to clarify any points for those that are new to Forum. Ed, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to quickly add, just because it's on that point, I believe that there is a plan to communicate that to head teachers, and to explain, do some explanation around the consultation as well, and the implications of those things. And I believe the mechanism for that would be head teachers briefing, or possibly like a maintain heads meeting.
I'm going to hand over to Liz at this point, who's very well put her hand up at the right time to answer your question, Ed.
So yes, thank you for that. We intend to issue the consultation immediately after half term, and it will run for a 3-week period up until, just so that we can hit the next Schools Forum working group. So it should run until about the 21st of November. There is a head teachers briefing within that period, so we certainly will talk at the head teachers briefing about that. However, I think from memory, the head teachers briefing is on the 18th, so it's quite late in that consultation period. So if WASH or PHF would like us to do some separate online briefings, we can definitely do that during that period. I did offer that before, and I'm still more than happy to do that. Similarly with governors, if that would be helpful to do. And just to update on how the consultation will be coming out, because that was a source of concern last year. We will be sending it out directly by email to head teachers and to chairs of governors, and we will include in that the consultation document, which will include some background. It will also include modelling of the potential financial impact of a 1% transfer and the reduction of minimum per pupil funding level, so that schools can see both of those options. We will have to base it on 25-26 figures though, because we don't have anything indicative for 26-27 yet, so it'll be similar to last year. And then included in the email will be a link to an electronic form for you to submit your consultation responses. So different to last year where you needed to write them out and email them in, there will actually be a direct link for you to respond this time. So hopefully that will make it easier for you to do so.
Thank you, Liz, very much for that clarification. That's great. Ed, back to you.
Yeah, just to say, Liz, thank you. That sounds great. To simplifying the process, making it as accessible as possible for head teachers. Definitely take you up on the possibility of hosting some kind of short meeting, ideally after school, where we can invite heads to jump on Teams and just kind of that opportunity to ask any questions. How do I believe there's working groups that come off the back of this, and I'm guessing this will be discussed at the SEND working group. Is that correct?
It will go to I think we've sort of combined the school funding working group and the SEND working group, and they have a meeting quite late in November prior to the next schools forum. So the consultation outcome will go to that group first, and it will then come to schools forum in December.
Great. Could I just express interest in being on that working group, if that's possible? Yeah, if someone could send me the invite to that, that would be great.
I'm happy to do that. And
Great.
Consider yourself invited.
Thanks, Marie. Appreciate that.
Great. Always good to get new members for our working groups along the way, which is marvellous. Thanks, Ed, for volunteering. Stella, you have your hand up?
Yes, just very quickly. Liz, apologies. You did give this information, but I didn't note it down quickly enough. What was the November deadline?
It will be 21st of November that will close the consultation, and I've spoken with Vicky Christopher and Governor Services about how we get it out it'll come out on the first week after half term, and I've spoken with her about how we make sure we get it out to all chairs of governors on that date.
Excellent, yes, and thank you on behalf of governors, and we would be interested to kind of have you represent that in some format. We can discuss that later. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. Some rich conversation there about the consultation ahead of it coming out, and I think, you know, just to acknowledge the work that's gone in to make that more accessible this year based on the feedback from last year. So it is important that all schools engage with that consultation, and the more able we can make that to happen, the better, I think, moving forwards. So going back to the minutes, I will take the assent of the meeting to agree these minutes. I move that they're approved. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Graham, very much indeed. If everyone's okay, then I'll make arrangements with the clerk to sign the meeting minutes when we next meet in person, which will be our December meeting if I don't see Lisa before. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 5 on the agenda then this afternoon. I'd like to thank Councillor Hubbard to start off with for his proactivity in writing to MPs following our last schools forum meeting in June. I don't know if you've got any update, Councillor Hubbard, that you'd like to give us at this point, or if you've heard anything back from that correspondence. I think I might take that as a no. Okay, I'll keep going. It may come in later on. The other item for my announcements this afternoon is just to say that depending on time and where we are with the various papers that we've got this afternoon, we may take a short comfort break at about 3 o'clock if we need to. Does anybody else have any other announcements this afternoon, please? Lovely. Moving on to item 6. Does anybody have any declarations of interest? No declarations of interest to note, Lisa. You can move on to item 7. This is public participation. Lisa, can you confirm if we've had any statements or questions received in advance of the meeting, please?
No, we haven't had anything submitted this time.
Okay, thank you very much. And I know we've got an update on one of the items that was raised back in June later on in the meeting. So moving on to item 8 this afternoon, this is updates from the working groups. Schools Forum is asked to note the minutes and updates as per pages 27 to 30 of the agenda pack and pages 3 to 5 of the agenda supplement, which are the meetings in the first instance of the early years reference group held on the 11th of June and the 23rd of September 2025. Has anybody got any questions on these minutes, please? I see no hands up. So I propose that we agree to note the minutes of those meetings. Do I have a seconder for that? Preferably somebody who was present at the meeting, please. That's brilliant. Thank you, Karen, very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree those notes unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. So secondly, it's to note the minutes and updates as per pages 7 to 9 of the agenda supplement, which is the joint meeting of the School Funding and SEN Working Group that was held on the 24th of September 2025. Has anybody got any questions on those minutes, please? Lovely. Then I propose that we agree to note those minutes of that meeting. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Again, preferably somebody who was present at the meeting. Thank you, Graham, very much. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree those notes unless I hear otherwise. Wonderful. Then moving on to item 9 on our agenda this afternoon. This is the Wiltshire Schools Forum Proportionality, Membership and Terms of Reference. The purpose of this report, which can be found on pages 31 to 44 if you include the appendix of the agenda, is to inform Schools Forum that a review of the proportionality has taken place and the annual review of the membership of Schools Forum has been carried out. I'm going to hand over to Lisa for this item, please.
Okay, so we will hopefully have all read the report. I won't go through it in detail. So Grant carried out a review during the summer of this year to check the proportionality to see if we needed to make any changes to our makeup. And whilst there had been some conversions to academies, that didn't significantly affect the numbers. So no changes are needed to the way the Schools Forum is broken down. So we're not recommending a change there. And obviously with no change to proportionality, we don't need to change our terms of reference, and they are still as they were in January 23. I've shared the details of the current membership. We've obviously lost some members and gained a couple new members, and we still currently have 2 vacancies for primary academy representatives, and I believe they are being sought so that we have a full team. And the recommendations are set out in the report and on the screen there. And are there any questions? Stella.
Hello, I apologise, it's me again. You'll recall that last year the Wiltshire Governors Association reconstituted as the Wiltshire Governance Network to represent the inclusivity of governance at all levels, including trustees. So I think we updated it last year, but it's snuck back in again as WGA.
Oh,
can it be WGN?
Absolutely.
Small point, but important.
Well spotted, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Lisa, please? Okay, then I propose that Schools Forum note that the proportionality of the forum has been reviewed and that no changes are recommended. Note that no changes to the terms of reference as agreed on the 4th of January 2023 are recommended. Note the current membership details of the forum, and finally seek to appoint the 2 current primary academy representative gaps that there are for Schools Forum. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Stella. It's like buses, no seconders, and then they all come along at once. But thank you very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Okay, moving on speedily then to item number 10 this afternoon. This is the school's revenue surplus and deficit balances for 2024-25. The purpose of this report, which can be found on pages 43 to 45 of the agenda, is to present the position of the revenue balances for Wiltshire Maintained Schools as at the 31st of March 2025, and identifies those in surplus and deficit. I'm going to hand over to Grant for this item, please.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. And well, welcome to this report. Well, the one that we always look forward to each year at this time of year to have a look at and see what the balances look like for our Wiltshire maintained schools as at the end of the last financial year. And I'm pleased to say in many respects that the report shows that we've still got schools mainly in surplus balances as opposed to deficit balances, which is quite a relief given the funding constraints that so many of our schools are facing nowadays. So having looked at the balances, once we've closed down, financially closed down, I should say, all of the maintained schools, the net position is that we've got balances of £9 million across our schools, maintained schools in Wiltshire. 83 of those schools out of the 99 are holding surplus balances. That's 10.3 million across those 83 schools. And we've got 16 schools in deficit with a cumulative balance of 1.3 million. So when we look at where we were a year ago and we presented the report this time last year, what we saw at that point was for the previous financial year was that we had the net position was £11.3 million and we had 95 schools holding a surplus balance of 13.1 million and 14 schools in deficit at that point to the tune of 1.9 million. Now we know that the number of maintained schools has decreased over the last financial year. So we're down from 109 maintained schools to 99 for the actual financial year. And what we've done is we've excluded those schools that converted during the financial year so as not to skew the overall figures. If I just take you to the table at paragraph 5, what we can see across the last couple of years is what has the net position been in terms of our balances, and we can see really going straight for the bottom line, we can see that back at the end of the 22-23 year, our net position was that we had schools with £12.2 million worth of balances. That then dropped to 11.3 million and we're now down at £9 million. So we can see that year on year there's been a drop in those balances that are being held by our schools, but at the same time there has been a drop in the number of our maintained schools too, as we've seen schools convert across to become academies. So what can we see, what's one of the main points there? We can see that the surplus balances or the net position has dropped by 20% in terms of those balances being held. But whenever we look at the net position, quite often that skews the real underlying data because we're looking at some schools got surplus balances and some have got deficit balances. So if I quickly take you to the table at paragraph 6, what we can see here, we've broken down the schools into those with surplus balances on the left hand side and those with deficit balances on the right hand side. And what we can see overall there is the movement of those surplus balances. So back in the 22-23, those schools that had surplus at that time, we had 14.4 million was our net position, and that dropped down to 13.1 million, and we're now down at 10.3 million for those schools holding surplus balances. And at the same time, what we can see is that the deficit balances in our maintained schools have dropped over that period from 2.2 million back in 22-23 down to 1.8 million and now down to 1.3 million. So there's been a bit of a journey there in terms of the reduction of both surplus balances and a reduction in those deficit balances too. Now, most of you will have already had a look at the appendices, but just referring to Appendix 1, what we have in Appendix 1 is a list of all the maintained schools that we had at the end of the 24-25 year in Wiltshire, and what were their balances at that point. And we look at both the committed revenue balances and the uncommitted. The uncommitted revenue balance is simply the balance of funds that are just there as a general reserve. Committed ones may be for a specific purpose, such as any rolled forward PE grant or pupil premium to be used for a specific purpose. Then what we do in the sheet is to look at what's the school budget share and work out what is that surplus or deficit balance as a percentage of the overall budget share for the individual schools. And I don't intend going through all the individual schools because you've got access to that appendix there, but it sets out each individual maintained school that we've got in Wiltshire. Now, as part of the DfE's framework, they can ask us to provide additional information. And the two criteria they use is if we've got 5% of our schools that have had a surplus balance of greater than 15% of their school budget share over a period of the last 5 years, and that surplus is greater than £10,000. Also, they can ask for more information from us if we've got more than 2.5% of our schools that have been in deficit by 2.5% or more over the last 4 years, and where those deficits are greater than £10,000. And actually, we do fit into that category, and we have done for a number of years, and the DfE haven't ever come to us to seek any additional information, but it's just part of their assurance framework. So it's quite useful at this point just to move on to Appendix 2. And in Appendix 2, what we've classified is the schools into almost 3 different categories. Those schools that have got surplus balances greater than 15% of their budget share, those that are 15% or below of their school budget share, and then schools that are in deficit. And what we can see there, if we look at the appendix, on the left-hand side, what we've got is those schools that have got greater than 15% of their school budget share as a surplus. And we know they've got 25 schools in that position, a majority primary schools, and 1 secondary and 1 special school. And then when we look at the middle group in there, these are the schools that have got a surplus balance that's less than 15%. And that's where the majority of schools sit. We've got 58 schools in that category. And again, the majority of being the primary schools in there. And then if we move to the right-hand side of the table, what we've got here is the schools that are in deficit. And we've actually seen a couple more schools fall into deficit in the 24-25 financial year. So we've got 16 schools in deficit, and you can see that the cumulative deficit there is £1.3 million. So that one just gives you a little bit greater analysis around the actual balances that are being held by schools and breaking it down into those 3 individual categories. If we look now at Appendix 3, and again, this shows that potentially we could have an investigation from the DfE. And when I say an investigation, it would be them coming to ask us what are our schools doing with their balances. And what we're looking at here in particular is those schools that have got revenue balances, so surplus balances, of greater than 15% of their school budget share, and those that have held those for more than 5 years. And if we look at the appendix that I've highlighted in that sort of buff colour, the schools that are in that category, they've held a surplus reserve of greater than 15% of their school budget share for greater than 5 years. And you can see the schools in there highlighted. What we've tried to do is put a little arrow in there to show whether the reserve is increasing or decreasing for each of those schools. And sometimes the schools drop off the list and sometimes new ones pop onto the list. But the ones that have been consistently on there are the ones we've highlighted in the buff colour. And we can see for most of those schools, actually their reserves are dropping year on year, which probably doesn't surprise a lot of you. Those that are at the sharp end of school funding will know that it's been particularly tricky over the last couple of years. So we're seeing a drop off in those numbers of schools. And then finally, we've got Appendix 4 on here, which shows those schools that have been in deficit, unfortunately, and that those schools that have held deficit balance greater than 2.5% of their school budget share for the last 4 years. So if we look at Appendix 4, what we can see in there, and again, we've highlighted these in the purple colour on there, those schools that have had that deficit for the last 4 years. And there are only a few schools on there, and it's unfortunate that we do have schools in deficit in Wiltshire, but it's nice to see that of those ones that are in deficit, most of them are reducing down. And the one that I think probably will be of most interest to members of schools forum, and we have discussed this at previous meetings, is Abbeyfield, who used to have a deficit which was over £2 million, and it's lovely to see that that deficit now is down at just over £400,000 at the end of the school's last financial year. Worth noting that as part of that, the drop in that deficit in the last year, the school did receive a refund for relating to the PFI contract that the school is in, having overpaid on a catering element of that contract for a number of years. The refund was due to that school, which helped towards reducing the value of the deficit in there. So what are the main points we want to share with you? Well, the net revenue balance of £9 million, so it has decreased by £2.3 million compared to this time last year. But what we've also seen is also the value of our deficit balance is reducing as well over that period. So the surplus balance have decreased by 21.3%, but also the deficit balances have decreased by 27.6% as well. We've got 16 schools that are in deficit, and we know that the overall cumulative balance of the deficit has dropped by just over £500,000 from 1.86 million down to 1.3 million. The number of schools in surplus has dropped too, and the value of those surpluses collectively has decreased by 2.8 million, down from 13 million to 10.3 million. And again, looking at those appendices, there is the potential that the authority could have an investigation from the DfE based upon those surplus balances or deficit balances that we're holding in schools. Now, it's always good to look backwards and see what the history tells us, but we also need to look forward as well to see what do the forecasts for our schools tell us about school funding and where we're likely to be. Well, as you can imagine, it's a bit difficult to have a definitive figure of where all our maintained schools will end up at the end of this financial year, the 25-26 year. But noting that we had the 4% teachers pay award, the 3.2% support staff pay award, the national insurance increase, those higher levels of inflation, it does leave a very unpredictable position for our schools, particularly when we've had below inflation uplift in school funding in the last year as well. So when we looked at the schools projections and forecasts, it's not a pretty picture looking forward, I'm afraid to say. But nonetheless, we'll have to wait and see what the Chancellor gives us in November. Now, also, you'll recall, following this report at last year's Schools Forum meeting, there was a request from a member of Schools Forum that we should look into some of the school balances being held, particularly the surplus balances being held, and what the purpose behind a number of those balances was for. So a task and finish group was set up during the last year to look at some of those balances, and a number of the schools were contacted where they had a surplus balance of greater than 15% of their school budget share as a reserve balance. So all of those schools were contacted, and we have got an Appendix 5 to this report as well that you'll have seen, looking for those responses to understand what schools were holding those surplus balances for and what their intended purposes were. And it probably won't surprise you to know that not all the schools did respond on that one. And from the response we received, we could see that a number of those schools were holding them to try and stave off future cuts in their income because of the challenging financial climate we're in. 2 schools had converted to academies during that period, but the majority were trying to retain a contingency towards either future financial issues or towards some capital projects they were doing at the school, to do some structural works at the school or something of that order as well. So none of the schools came back and particularly wanted to share great information with us, but we did understand how some of the schools were operating and why they'd been saving some of those reserves. And in the majority of cases, it was to stave off future budget cuts that they would like to see from the drop in the numbers of pupils coming into their schools, and also for some of those works at the school as well. So that's Appendix 5 that we've got in there, and really it's open to any questions at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant, very much, and thank you to your team for pulling all of that together as well. Does anybody have any questions or queries for Grant, please? I see no hands. I hear nobody saying anything. Grant, you might have escaped with nothing, but I think a recompense for a very comprehensive paper. So thank you very much. I propose that Schools Forum note, and if there are no comments, but note this report. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Brett, very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Oh, thank you, John, as well. We'll have 2 seconders. Always good. Thank you very much. Moving on then to item 11 of our agenda this afternoon. This is the dedicated schools budget monitoring for 25-26. The purpose of the report, which can be found on pages 57 to 60 of the agenda, is to present our budget monitoring information against the dedicated schools grant for the financial year 2025-26. I'm going to hand over to Marie for this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. So this is the budget monitoring report that goes up to the forecast information at the end of June, which may seem to a lot of you quite an old report. However, it's really important for us not to report any figures publicly that haven't been shared with Cabinet first. That's why we're a little bit behind the curve. I'm not intending to go through the appendices. There's quite a lot of detail, and I've extracted the pertinent points and put them into the body of the report. The first being the table at the end of page 57. So our cumulative deficit is currently allowable under a statutory override, and this is introduced by central government in recognition of the national issues back in 2020. the latest information that we have about the national level of deficit is they are at 2.6 billion nationally, and that number I will expect to be refreshed pretty soon, so may be able to update that for the next report. So table 1 there shows the overall DSG position. You'll see a significant underspend in the early years block and pressure on the high needs block, which is our usual position, unfortunately. And this is on top of the planned drawdown that we've already got from the DSG reserve. So a total adverse variance or overspend forecast of 45.422 million. Thanks, Lisa. Over the page in the report, we'll look at the blocks in a little bit more detail. So firstly, early years. Table 2 shows that the underspend aligns with less take-up than we were funded for. So some of this funding is estimated based on the census data that we've provided, and some of it, because we're edging into new territory with some of the new under 2s and 2-year-old funding elements that the DFE have introduced, are based on their own estimates, which is probably why they're a little bit out of kilter. However, I can confirm that for September, the new academic year, the numbers have gone up considerably with the new intakes where expansion has been extended, which is really good news for our children. So a small forecast variance on the schools block just relates to vacancies in some of the central teams there. And on to high needs. So table 3 shows forecast demand in EHC plans, and that also shows the prior year data. And despite much activity, some of which will be touched on later, in the high needs recovery space, the demand is still something we find challenging. Over the page, tables 4 and 5 show where our children and young people are placed, and also shows the average unit cost. So you can see that it's considerably higher for external placements than for our own provision. And some of those children are placed at quite a distance from their home and not in their own communities. With regards to prices, so the table 5, we've seen the largest price increases, so above what we'd budgeted, in the independent sector, down at the bottom again, 26% increase. Also in other local authorities provision and in alternative provision. So this could be due to a number of factors, including rising inflation, profits, but also the complexity of learners. And then Overleaf, the central block, our smallest block, has a small variance, which is due to vacancies and also the admission appeals income that's credited to that team. Finally then, the DSG reserve. Table 6 shows the reserve, which sits on the local authority's balance sheet and is also cash flowed by the local authority. So our brought forward balance was just over 61 million. Now that's, I suppose, based on the latest overspend from 24-25, which was 38.154 million. We've had a negative early years adjustment, which is always done after the event by the DFE. We have one in year and then one after the year. And then for this year, our planned drawdown and our forecast variance total 45.422 million. So we can already see that the pressure on this year is higher than the pressure on the last financial year. Finally then, one of our safety valve payments that were due, part of being the safety valve scheme, that will help us, and that goes directly into our DSG deficit to help offset some of that pressure. So our forecast carry forward is just over 100 million and a half really. So that's the position with the DSG reserve. Safety valve agreement is in place and has been agreed. We are continuing to do the good work in that place. And as I say, the next report will detail some of that work. There are some risks around the statutory override coming to an end. I can't see that, my personal opinion is that I can't see that coming to an end until there is a solution for councils, because it would leave us in a really difficult financial position amongst many other local authorities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Marie, very much. And I think it's just worth mentioning that lots of other local authorities are having the same conversations at the moment in a similar situation as Marie's just stated. So thank you very much for that. Does anybody have any questions for Marie, please? Yeah, Liz, did you want to just mention that as well? You've just put something in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the statutory override's actually extended till the 31st of March 2028 rather than 2026, which is what's written on the slide.
Ah, yes, sorry, it's mentioned at the end. Oh, right. Yes, it's in the it's in the report.
It's
right?
in the paper.
Slide's
It's
right.
correct. Yeah, it's just
Apologies.
an error on the slide, but yeah, it's there till the end of March 2028.
Which gives us a little bit longer to not think about that part of it.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments? Anything for Marie? Doesn't look like it, Marie. Thank you very much. Again, very comprehensive and lots of information there, but in a format that makes it helpful for us to understand as well, which is great. So I propose that Schools Forum note the forecast budget monitoring position, including the balance on the DSG reserve at the end of June 2025, together with the report later in the agenda. In fact, it's the next item on SEND transformation, which will talk through some of that work that's being done. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Carol, very much indeed. That's great. I will take the assent of the meeting, therefore, to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. So moving on to item 12 of the agenda this afternoon. This is our SEND transformation update. The purpose of the report, which can be found on pages 65 to 88 of the agenda, is to update Schools Forum on the SEND transformation programme and shares the first quarterly monitoring report for 2025-26. I'm going to hand over to Liz and Ben for this item, please.
Thanks, Chair. We'll start with me, and then as soon as there's anything complicated, I'll hand back to Liz. So yes, this report, as you've just said, summarises the Q1 monitoring update that we sent to the DFE. Again, as Marie said in the introduction to her item, that seems like very old information now, but it is important to make sure that we're reporting back to Schools Forum in this kind of open and transparent way about what we're telling the DFE in terms of our progress. So the Q1 report asks us a series of questions. Schools Forum have received these reports before, but this is the first one in a new format. The previous format was a bit more strict. Are you on track? Yes or no? And that was kind of it. This at least does ask us for a slightly more nuanced position. So it asks us whether we feel that within the LA appropriate support is being delivered for children and young people. We were able to answer yes to that very confidently. We were asked whether the LA was moving towards an in-year balance, and we were able to answer yes to that as well. Whether the LA was moving towards full eradication of the DSG deficit, and we responded yes. Just to say about those two, that is despite the deficit continuing to be forecast for this year. We're still expecting to have a deficit this year, and we're also expecting the cumulative deficit, that is to say the deficit we've built up over time, to increase this year as well. But because that was part of our plan, we were able to say yes to those questions. We are expecting to have those deficits this year. The next question was about whether we were delivering on all the conditions set out in our safety valve agreement. We had to answer no to that one. Schools Forum might remember that we went to the DFE a year ago and said that we were not going to be able to meet our obligations within a 5-year period. Would they be happy with the 7-year period? They came back and said, yes, you can have your 7-year period, but we're not going to change your agreement. And so we will have to answer no to that question for the rest of the period of our agreement, because they won't change the agreement. And then finally, is the local authority safety valve capital project on track? And we were again able to answer yes to that. The report contains the more detailed bits that sit behind those answers, and I won't go into those right now. If I go to the next slide though, Lisa. What the report also then does is highlight some of the things that were starting to happen after we'd submitted that DFE monitoring report, but before we submitted this report to Schools Forum, because we obviously have the benefit of another couple of months of information, and some of this is also covered by Marie's report, and so I won't repeat what she said, but it is worth just emphasising that the high needs budget is forecast to overspend beyond what we'd planned to overspend it by, and so that's obviously not moving in the right direction. The number of EHCPs is higher than we were expecting at this point. There's two reasons for that. The first one is an unalloyed positive, which is that we've cleared the 20-week deficit more quickly, sorry, 20-week backlog more quickly than we expected to. And so those children who were previously waiting for that support have their plans in place now, and that's great. But it does mean we've just got more plans than we expected to at this point in the plan. The second reason that number of EHCPs is higher than forecast is because we have not ceased as many plans as we had expected to as part of this process, and so we're just starting to see that gap between our expectations that we told the DFE we were going to achieve and what's actually happening grow, and so that's why that number of EHCPs is higher than forecast. We do still believe that the overarching strategy to manage this growth and the deficit is the right one. We don't really see that there is another approach that we would feel comfortable implementing without starting to affect the support that we give for children and young people in Wiltshire. And so I think it's really keen. I'm really keen to emphasise that despite the additional pressures that the local authority is experiencing in that deficit, we still believe that the approach that we need to follow is improving support and through that decreasing demand for statutory plans, and we can only do that by working with schools. And so we're really grateful for the relationship we have with Schools Forum and with the wider schools community in terms of delivering this plan. So I did just want to emphasise that, because I think this is a whole system problem and we'll only solve it with a whole system response. And so that's really that's really what I wanted to emphasise there. Can I have the next slide, Lisa? Oh, the next slide isn't me, so not the next slide. But yes, so the report is as written. As I say, I won't go through all of the pages of detail. It is worth reflecting on the fact that the plan isn't quite heading in the right direction yet. I think we were starting to see some encouraging signs. The EHCNA request pattern had looked very encouraging, and when we look at the SEND2 data that we submitted in January for the whole of the 2024 year, we had seen a 5% decrease in Wiltshire of those EHCNA requests, which was in stark contrast to all of our statutory neighbours and most other local authorities in the country had continued to see an increase. And we felt like that was starting to demonstrate the positive impact of people like the MESAs, the early years pathway navigators, the school and family support practitioners, all those sort of practical interventions that were helping support alternative routes other than an EHCP. We felt like those were positive signs. Unfortunately, some of that progress has been undone more recently, and while in a complex system, one should never be tempted to definitively say that correlation and causation are the same. It is worth noting that increase that we started to see again happened in May, and that was around the time that there were some unguarded comments about the national reforms, which led to concerns amongst parent carers in particular, and so it's not unreasonable for parent carers to respond to that by seeking support maybe earlier than they would have done otherwise. So I think it's a really complex picture. There's clearly a volatility being injected by the talk of national reform, and I think that is going to continue to make this quite a challenging piece of work to undertake, but we will continue to do that in strong partnership with Schools Forum, because that's, as I said earlier, that's the only way we can possibly solve this.
Thank you, Ben, very much. Liz, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or happy that?
No, I don't think there's anything to add.
I think it is important to recognise that national picture, though, and that news comes out, and that does then lead to responses, because everybody wants the best for these young people. And if parents feel that there is a way to respond to that, and that's what they need to do, then they do. And something I'm sure the Parent Carer Council is finding more of at the moment in those parental requests. Thank you very much, Ben, for that report. Has anybody got any questions for Ben, please? Stella.
Hello, thank you, Ben, for the report. I have two questions. One is just a point of clarification. Can you please remind me what EHCNA stands for?
That's the Education, Health and Care Needs Assessment. So that's the assessment to decide whether someone requires an EHCP.
Okay, thank you. And my second question relates to the bizarre situation around us having an extension but not having an extension, which means that the DFE governance around the timing of our safety valve plan is essentially null and void in terms of the timescale, which I think leaves, well, it's a question. Does that leave Schools Forum with the additional responsibility of ensuring that the deadline doesn't slip further? And what reassurances can you give Schools Forum that it won't? So we've got this extended deadline, which is outside of the plan. My question is just around how we manage that as a forum.
I think that's a really helpful question, and I should say we're not the only local authority that are in that position. Quite a number of local authorities who had submitted revised plans found that they received the same confusing message back from the DFE about the plan can be extended but the agreement can't. I don't think it increases any risk for Schools Forum because the plan has to can only be delivered in the way that we are delivering it. I think it would be fair to say that particularly with national reform coming down the track, the commitment to holding systems feet to the fire from the DFE's point of view has lessened slightly. I think they are reflecting in their monitoring of these plans that the system is especially challenging at the moment, and that actually it's very challenging, I suppose, to deliver on any of these plans, and so they are monitoring us with that in mind, which I think is welcome. We are now asked when our advisors. We have two advisors, a SEND advisor and a finance advisor from who are appointed by the DFE. When they give feedback on our plan to the DFE, there's a third category that they can use. They used to be able to just say, yes, it's good, or no, it's not. They now have a third category, which is the authority is doing the best it can given the current circumstances. And I think, again, that is reflecting the fact that this is incredibly challenging. So while we welcome Schools Forum's support, I don't think there's any additional risk to Schools Forum from the slightly unusual position that we find ourselves in with a 5-year agreement and a 7-year plan.
If I could ask a follow-up question, so specifically, there's not a chance that we can't be given the money that DFE have contributed to the plan because of this scenario?
I wouldn't want to go that far because the DFE could choose to withhold payments because the plan is off track. They have shown no indication that they will, at this point, do that to Wiltshire, and so I don't foresee that being a risk. If that was to happen, we did, when we were negotiating, structure the plan to front load some of the payments, so we have received over half of the money that we were expecting at the moment, and so again that reduces the risk. But at the moment the DFE haven't given any indication that is a likely thing to happen to Wiltshire.
Okay, thank you. And one final follow-up question, if I may. I apologise, I'll stop then. It's around the timescale. Do you foresee that being a firm and final timescale, or with the current kind of challenges around the overspend and the EHCP increases and the lack of kind of reduction in EHCPs, do you envisage that timescale is now fixed, or is it feeling uncomfortable?
I think it's I think again that's a very savvy question.
Sorry, I'm tricky questions.
It's really good to have challenge. So I think there's two answers to that. One is where we assume that we know nothing of the future, and that the current system will be the system for the whole length of our plan. And I think that we would, that at the moment, because the plan isn't heading in the right direction, I couldn't give a confident answer that says that 2031 everything will be solved. That said, there at some point someone is going to ask for this money to be paid off, and at the moment that looks like 120-ish million pounds of cumulative deficit, and that simply isn't a sustainable position. So we do need to address that, whether we think that 2031 is a really achievable answer or not. The second answer, though, is where we know that there's some reforms coming, and that the system that we currently have is very unlikely to be the system that we have by 2031. And there's a whole set of sort of future guessing that is going on in terms of what that looks like and how that changes the shape of the system, how that changes the shape of support that we're offering. I mean, there's so many factors there that mean that it's difficult to give a really definitive answer on that. Yeah, I think you're right to highlight that it's an incredibly challenging picture that this report presents, and that it's going to be difficult.
In the spirit of conversation, I apologise, Chair, and tell me that I may not ask any more questions if you like. But my final question then is in you're looking forward to the white paper by virtue of it being that we're expecting this autumn, which could mean anything. Given that it's a white paper, it's not really massively consultative, I guess. Will the council be responding? Are there plans for the council to respond to the white paper when it comes?
Yes, we definitely will be responding, and we're already having conversations and have been invited to conversations with the DFE to give feedback on the white paper when it's published. And yeah, we're continuing to use as many channels as we can to just sort of make the case, particularly around the sort of inequitable funding and the F40 bit of the puzzle, because again that feels like that is a key thing that the white paper, the wider schools reforms need to look at. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that rich conversation, because I think it's really good to have that, and I think highlights a lot of the challenges that we face with the plan moving forwards, but also the fact that we're all waiting for this white paper, and it may come soon, it may come in a few weeks, months, don't know, and it's all a bit challenging really to know how that's all going to play out. So that's going to change the landscape again when it does land and when we need to look at it. Any other questions for Ben on that paper or Liz? Okay, then I propose that Schools Forum note the content of the report. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Pam, very much indeed. Thank you, Stella. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. Then moving on to, oops, sorry, missed my place. Moving on to item 13 of our agenda this afternoon. This is an update on the Families First Partnership Programme. I'm going to invite Simon Thomas, our FACT Programme Lead, to present an update on the Families First Partnership Programme. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chair, and thank you for time to present to you this afternoon. There are some colleagues who've heard me talk to this before, so I won't be offended if a few cameras flick off at this point and people maybe go and make themselves a cup of tea or coffee. But for those of you who haven't heard this before, what we wanted to do is just use this as an opportunity to share with you our thinking, our response in terms of a piece of government legislation and guidance that's come out in the last 6 to 9 months under the title of the Families First Partnership Programme. So my role within the Families and Children's Transformation Programme is to lead on this. It's not a council agenda specifically. This is a partnership agenda. So the government has set this out. It's integrated within the Plan for Change, which in turn then contains the Wellbeing in Schools Bill. The Families First Partnership Programme then sits within that and alongside the Best Start in life. So hopefully some elements of government guidance and policy and legislation that ring bells with people. Unfortunately, slightly frustratingly, we're out of sync with the SEND reforms, as Ben's just been talking to. And so there's a degree of anticipation, I suppose, in terms of how these might potentially align. We have done presentations to colleagues through primary heads in the last 2-3 weeks. So we had some primary heads events and the maintained primaries, and also secondary heads conference. We're really pleased with the responses we've had in terms of, it's a message, I think, of we're working on this. We're in relatively early stages, but the engagement of schools and education colleagues is absolutely vital. The statutory partners are the police, the Council's social care, and the Integrated Care Board, brackets health. However, the legislation is very clear that the role of education is absolutely vital. So what's this all about? It's about a programme of system reform, and it's about looking at, in each local authority area across England, how do organisations work together to provide the best possible help to our children, young people and families. And at a national level, the government has some views about how we should be seeking to work. And they've tested this in a number of Pathfinder areas over the past couple of years, and are now at the point of rolling out across the country this guidance. It's not a blueprint. It doesn't tell us how to do it. It tells us what we need to ensure we're achieving, and then gives us scope at a local level to work out how best to do that. So critically, this is about greater integration across what would probably traditionally have been silos of work. So where we look at families, we look at children, and we've tended historically to end up with them being in boxes. And those boxes might have titles like targeted early help, we have a child in need box, and we have a child protection box. And what this reform is saying is that we need to find ways to be more seamless and consistent across those and between those boxes. So we know that families and children's needs change, and the traditional system will then mean that as those needs change, so too will their lead professional, so too will be the paperwork that follows them, so too will be the assessment framework, the intervention set, and so on. And this piece of work is all about saying, can we be more consistent? So our starting point in Wiltshire is really important here, in that we need to think about, well, what have we already got? How do we already work? Because our response to these reforms in Wiltshire will be different to the response in Swindon, different to the response in Haringey, different to the response in North Tyneside. So we have a lot of scope to do what's right locally, which again is why the input engagement with schools is really vital. What we don't want to do is miss this opportunity to reform things in the best possible way for Wiltshire. We don't want to just deliver, something that ticks the DFE box, and there's a few DFE boxes here to be ticked, if I'm honest. But whilst we do need to tick those boxes, obviously, we want our solution to actually make a difference for staff working in schools, but really, really importantly, make a difference for our children, our young people and their families. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Lisa. So there's 3 areas to the reforms, and they're focused around what the government uses as titles: family help, multi-agency child protection, and family group decision making. So I'll go through these briefly, but try and highlight for schools what this may mean. And it is a may mean because we are still exploring what our responses might look like. So there is this seamlessness that I've referred to. So the aspiration at a national level and therefore a local level is just making sure that we don't pass families between professionals just as their levels of need change. We want to make sure that families have consistency of workers working with them, and particularly across those levels of complexity, so that families aren't having to tell their stories again and again as they change and move through our system. And one of the big things I think from a school's perspective here is that there's an opportunity to review and hopefully streamline, simplify our assessment and planning processes. So at the moment, at an early help level, we have our early support assessments, but interestingly in Wiltshire, a family might also have a SEND support plan during that early stage of SEND need. But then as needs progress, we then move families across onto a child in need assessment and plan, and then we have totally separate sets of paperwork for child protection and so on. So we're doing a piece of work, and we've been doing some testing that hopefully some of you will be aware of in the early years space, to align the early support assessment, so what previously, for those of you who've been around a while, you might have known as a CAF, so our ESA, how we can align that with the SEND support plan, but also really importantly, how we can make sure that whatever documentation we're using can then progress really easily through into that child in need level of need and potentially up into statutory social care. So let's minimize the number of documents we use. So when we've met with the primary heads, secondary heads, we've asked, we've shown them where we've got to in terms of paperwork. We've told them the feedback we've already had, and really, really positively, we've had a number of heads volunteer to keep working with us on that. And also to then take that to their SENCOs, to their DSLs, to their pastoral care teams, so that whatever changes we make, they've been involved in, and hopefully the paperwork makes as much sense as possible. We know that's a biggie for schools. In the multi-agency child protection team space, I think the big issue here that the government are encouraging us to explore is, whilst we are normally pretty solid on how social care, police and health work together around child protection, sometimes there may be opportunities to engage more effectively with the education providers for the children or the child involved. So we're looking at how might we potentially improve the links and the interfaces between education and those statutory child protection partners. So when we have child protection conferences, do they work for schools or an academy perspective, or could they work differently? How do we use virtual versus physical face-to-face meetings? How does the paperwork move around, etc., etc.? So we're really keen to engage with schools on that one to make sure we identify any opportunities for improvement, and we test and sense check any changes we're making. And then the last area here is, I think it's a bit more of a fundamental principle, is the idea of how do we involve families in their own plans? How do we involve families at the heart of their own decision making? So rather than doing things to families, how do we work alongside them and work with them? At the moment, we've got quite strong mechanisms, for instance, around our child protection pre-proceedings, and around our whole Section 47 processes when we take a child into care. But across the rest of our system, I think there are potentially opportunities to bring families a bit more front and centre to some of our processes, some of our approaches. So those are the sorts of things we're looking at. If we can go to the next slide, Lisa. As I alluded to at the start, what's really important is that whatever we do works for Wiltshire. So we've got to make the differences that we need to make, and they'll be different to what changes other local authorities need to make. So this is very much about building on what we're good at. We know we've got some really, really good practice. We've had really positive Ofsted inspections. We've had a focused visit from Ofsted recently for social care around lots of this agenda, and it was very positive. So we're not on a burning platform here where we've got to radically change a lot of things, but we want to seize the opportunity and spot the areas where we can improve. And it is very much not just the social care agenda. Our approach to it is very much a genuine partnership one. Next slide. We've got a governance structure for this. I'm not going to spend too much time, but it's just to give you a reassurance that this is being done in a structured way, that the partnership runs through it. So our overview group, our executive board are all partnership forums. We've got work streams looking at the key strands of this. Again, they're all multi-agency. We've brought in an additional member of staff to ensure that during the kind of creation, exploration phase, we've got really strong links out into our Education and Skills Directorate, but also into schools, academies and early years settings. So many of you will know Helene Hughes. Helene is working with us for 2 days a week for the period through to the end of March, specifically as our conduit. So she is the person who's reaching out to schools. She understands the context. So therefore, hopefully the project will be really robustly informed and considered in any of its changes, any of its developments. And we have also got similar posts, so 2 days a week, to do the same to ensure that our links with the police are really strong, and with the Integrated Care Board, and out into all our health providers. So we've got a health secondment, a police secondment, and then Helene for education. And then I think my last slide, Lisa, it is just gives you a sense of the time frame. So between now and Christmas, we're doing our kind of co-creation, testing, looking at options, exploring potential models, with a view to start to create our plans for implementation during the spring. DFE they originally were quite prescriptive, and we're expecting a lot of these changes to be in by April next year, April 2026. I think they've started to realise the enormity of what they're asking local authorities to do. And I think they're also starting to realise that some of the national changes that are needed to enable local authorities to develop have not actually yet been put in place. So the government is having to do a lot around information governance, a lot around technological and technical solutions that originally they hadn't factored into the timeline. So the timeline has all shifted. What we're challenged with initially by April is the documentation for our assessment and plans. We have to have resolved that, agreed what that model's like, agreed the paperwork and so on by April. The other arrangements around the family help lead professionals, the working together with children in need and so on, and the multi-agency child protection teams, the plan is to start testing through most likely launching in specific geographical areas to test and pilot. We'll be doing that in the period from April 26 through till March 27. So there's quite a lot of pressure to develop the options and models to test. But what we're not looking for is by the 1st of April is for there to be radical change across the whole of Wiltshire. We're in a much, much stronger position than most local authorities, and there isn't a pressure to do that. But as I say, it's a real opportunity here to develop and enhance our working arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, very much for that information. Really useful. Anybody got any questions or comments or queries for Simon, please? Karen.
Yeah, so you talked a lot, Simon, about how you're working with the primary schools, secondary schools and education, but I'm always going to sit over here and bang the early years drum. You know, it's not something that's really come onto my agenda, you know, particularly with the concern that, you know, I'm getting a lot of children now with 30 hours attending setting, you know, 4 days a week, things like that. Sort of where do we sit in this plan of, you know, yes, you've taken some of it and the paperwork to schools, but where does that come in bringing it to the early years settings?
Yep. So for instance, with the assessment documents, that was all tested in early years settings initially. So Emma Cook and colleagues from within the Education and Skills Directorate are very much looking at this. We're seeing it as it is very much alongside the Best Start in Life. So without checking for definite, I don't know if Emma's on this call. No, in terms of the link across to the early years forums and so on, but I know that there is a plan, so I can perhaps, Karen, if I have a chat with Emma and we've come back following this meeting, take as an action that we'll just let you know what the intention is in terms of consultation and engagement.
yeah, you know, I'm chair of the early years reference group, so if it's something you need to come and talk to us in that position, I'm just conscious, like I say, with these children coming for 30 hours now, they're just in setting nearly as much as they are in primary schools. You know, it's been a very stark increase this September, and I think certainly from a reference group, it's not something we were anticipating. So I think that engagement, you know, we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, no, thank you for the offer, Karen. And as Catherine's popped into the chat, Helene's role isn't just to work with schools, it is schools and settings. So we have got Helene as a resource to support that engagement. Thank you.
But yeah, that's right.
Any other questions for Simon, please? Okay, great, Simon. Thank you very much indeed. I propose that Schools Forum note the update on the Families First Partnership Programme. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, David, very much. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. Okay, moving on to item 14 of our agenda. I am going to keep going because I think that we've got one item left, so I think it's probably worth it. This is an item on the funding for exceptional numbers of pupils with education, health and care plans. The purpose of the report, which can be found on pages 91 to 95 of the agenda, is to provide Schools Forum members with information following a question that was raised at the last meeting regarding does Wiltshire have a mechanism for allocated exceptional targeted funding for schools with exceptional numbers of EHCPs? And I'm going to hand over to, I'm not sure who, Grant or Liz, one or other of you, to update us on this programme, please.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And yes, I've got the button on this one, so away we go. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this is a question that was raised at our last Schools Forum meeting, and we said that we would do some work over the summer and report back to the October Schools Forum. And absolutely, the question came in around Wiltshire having a mechanism for funding exceptionally high numbers of pupils with EHCPs in particular schools. Now, having done some work to look at the various options and things in there, we need to sort of have basically a starting point. And the starting point is that the high needs funding regulations do allow us to have a scheme to support those schools where they have exceptionally high numbers of EHCPs, and we're allowed to do that. So we've got permission, as it were, within the funding regs to do that. But the important data that we've used for this is what we call the SEND2 data set. It's a census that's taken in January each year, and the results of that data set were published on the 12th of June, which is very timely for when this question was raised and gave us the most up-to-date data to be able to do some analysis. And I just thought it'd be useful at paragraph 5 just to share with you a quick table to show where we are in terms of Wiltshire compared to the national picture, as it were, for proportions of pupils with EHCPs and SEND support in the county, and where we have been between last year and this year. So what we can see in Wiltshire this year is our percentage of pupils with an EHCP is currently at 6.2%. The national picture is 5.3%. So we're above average when it comes to the proportion of pupils with an EHCP in Wiltshire. But when we're talking SEND support, where the Wiltshire position is 14.28%, the national picture at 14.2%, which means we're broadly in line with the national picture when it comes to SEND support. When we compare back to last year, we were actually above on both EHCPs and SEND support. So it just shows where our current picture currently sits in there. Okay, so just a quick reminder for colleagues on Schools Forum about how does the current funding mechanism work. So pupils with SEN can be assessed to determine whether they need an education healthcare plan, and where an EHCP is awarded, it'll confirm the pupil either requires a specialist type provisions, being something like a special school or resource base in primary and secondary, or an ELP provision place in secondary school. If not, then the pupil doesn't require that specialist provision, then the pupil will remain in mainstream school and receive something called an MPA, a named pupil allowance, to support that individual pupil. There are slight funding differences. They are quite subtle between pupils in a resource-based provision and those that are in mainstream settings with an MPA. And for the purpose of the report, we're going to pretty much skip over special schools because they're not really included in the scope of what we're looking at in here. These are for children in mainstream school settings. Okay, so what's the key differences between resource-based funding and NPA funding, and how does that really sit with us. So we all know that within the Wiltshire landscape, certain schools have got resource bases where they have places for children with particular types of need, and they're also authorised by the DfE to be running that resource provision. Now, when it comes to an MPA, all schools in Wiltshire can have a pupil with an MPA, and that's where they don't need any special permission, set up provision or anything else, but it's where mainstream school setting can meet that pupil's needs. So when we look at resource spaces receive what we call place funding of £6,000 for each place, whereas with an MPA pupil, there is no place funding. Again, with resource base, the school doesn't need to apply the notional SEN, and I know that's a very contentious topic, but doesn't have to apply notional SEN towards meeting the pupil's needs, whereas with an MPA pupil, the school is required to meet the first £6,000 of any pupil's needs through what they call the notional SEN. Then with resource bases, they're expected to use the all-PUE funding and pupil-led funding towards meeting the individual pupil's needs, whereas with an MPA, we're not expected to use the all-PUE because that's already included in creating the notional SEN. And in both systems, the pupil receives what we call a banded top-up to support the individual pupil's needs where it exceeds that £6,000. Okay, and it's quite common for schools to have both common for schools that have got a resource-based route provision to also have pupils with MPA as well. So what's the funding issue we've got? Well, I'm going to pretty quickly scoot over where we are with resource bases and ALP provision. We do work with schools around operating their resource bases or ALPs to make sure that the provision is in effect washing its face and it isn't putting a financial challenge into the school. So in other words, to make sure that the resource base is kind of self-funding and isn't being topped up by the rest of the school. And in most cases, we find that the resource-based provisions are being appropriately funded. So the real cost pressure is where we've got pupils with an MPA and the school is required to meet the first £6,000 through the notional SEN. Okay, now in the perfect world, our pupils with SEN would be distributed evenly across all schools, but we all know that that isn't the case and that certain schools become magnets, as it were, for pupils with SEN and particular needs in schools. Now, where a school is particularly popular or becomes that magnet and they have a disproportionately high number of pupils with an EHCP, it can put a financial burden onto those schools because they're required to meet that first £6,000 of any SEN requirements for the school, even though through the funding formula they're only receiving a proportionate amount of notional SEN funding, as it were. So we know that through the funding formula and the national funding formula we've got, that all schools are required to have a nominated notional SEN budget, as it were. And how do we calculate that? In Wiltshire, we very much mirror the national funding formula guidance. And what we do is we apply 5% of the all-PUE value for all schools, 50% of the deprivation funding schools receive, that's the FSM Ever 6 funding and the Adachi funding, and all of the low prior attainment funding. And that equates to being what we call the notional SEN, and that is very much the national picture as set out by the DfE for what we should be doing. Now, depending on the characteristics in individual schools, the notional SEN budget will be larger or smaller according to the size of the school there. But it does mean, and through the guidance from the DfE, that all schools are required to use their best endeavours to put in place the provision for all pupils with SEN. And the £6,000 notional SEN figure that we refer to isn't a target, and schools aren't expected to spend £6,000 on every pupil with SEN. It's just that that's the upper limit, and beyond that, the school should receive a top-up to support the individual needs of those pupils. Okay, now we all know that it's not an exact match, so the notional SEN funding isn't something that is going to be an absolute best fit. It's just something that the DfE have in place and an expectation for schools to put in place that provision. So moving on to the SEN2 data, okay, this is where it gets quite interesting. What we've tried to look at here is to try and say, well, what is the average proportion of pupils with the HCP in mainstream school settings? So what we've done is we've taken the total number of pupils on roll looked at those pupils with an EHCP using the SEND2 data, and we've removed all those pupils and places that are resource-based or ELP provisions in schools to get the net figure, as it were, of pupils with an EHCP in mainstream school settings, which in effect are our MPA pupils. And what we've equated that to, having gone through that, is we've got 68,000 pupils in our mainstream schools in Wiltshire. We've got 2,160 EHCPs, which is the net of the resource-based ELP special schools and so on and so forth, which means that we've got an average in Wiltshire of 3.16% of our pupils are have an EHCP in those mainstream school settings. Okay, so what we're looking at is schools where they've got higher than average proportions. So over the summer months, we did some modelling with this data, and Liz and I spent quite a number of afternoons going through the data and trying different models and how could we look at potential funding options for schools going forward. But as part of that work, it required us to sort of consider 4 particular questions in here, and I've set those out at paragraph 24. So the first one is, what do we mean by exceptional in terms of proportion? So we know the average is 3.16%. What makes a school exceptional? Is it 1% greater, 2% greater, 10% greater? Where does that sit? Then the next question was, if we were to agree to put in a funding mechanism, what sort of budget would we want to put in place? What quantum of funding should be there to support that budget to make it worthwhile for schools? There's no point in giving schools, a marginal amount of funding. It needs to be something relatively substantial. And how would we do that? Would we work at amount of funding? Would it be based on, in effect, a pupil unit above the average, or how would we equate that funding to come through? And then finally, think about what criteria would be in place. So we brought this conversation to the working group. That's the SEN and Schools Funding Working Group, and with representations taking place from both the Chair and Vice Chair of Schools Forum, the Director of Education Skills, the Head of SEN and Inclusion as well, and following very lengthy conversations, it was agreed that the decision should be postponed for the interim until we've seen the release that comes through from the DfE's SEND reform white paper, which is due to come out in the autumn of 2025. I know you're all asking, what is the autumn of 2025? When will it come out? My suspicion is it'll come out following the budget in November, on the 26th of November. So in terms of taking any real decisions on this one, it's agreed that what we should do would be to hold fire for now. Taking a decision in advance of the release of the white paper would probably be inappropriate. And then once the white paper has come through, we can look at bringing further options to Schools Forum when the implications of the white paper have been fully understood. And that's where we've got to in terms of that one. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Grant, very much, and thank you for the work you've done in pulling together that response. I think it was a bit difficult for us to make that decision to delay, but I do think it's the right thing to do until we've got more information, because we could make some decisions and then have to undo them all because of what the white paper comes out with. So I think it's the right thing to do at the moment, but I know a lot of work's gone into getting us to the point we're at the moment. Does anybody have any questions or queries or comments for Grant on that paper, please? Karen, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a good place to be. And I think at least it's given us a starting point and we're working from somewhere, whereas up until now we had nothing. So it feels like appropriate to have a starting point at least. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, I agree, and we've got all the data, which is useful because we can then use that moving forwards as well. I think that's the key to it all. We know what direction we could go in, but it's a case of waiting then to see what the SEND reforms say to inform that, really. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, then I ask that Schools Forum note the content of the report. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Brett, very much. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. And that's when we'll come back to when we know a little bit more about the white paper when it's released. Grant, are we putting bets on it coming out after the budget? I think you could run a bit of a sweepstake. I can think that could be quite productive, help us pay off the high needs block deficit. Okay. Moving on to item 15 of the agenda this afternoon. This is confirmation of dates of future meetings. The date of the next meeting is Thursday, the 11th of December. This is an in-person, face-to-face meeting at County Hall in Trowbridge at 1:30. I have no items under urgent items this afternoon, item 16 of the agenda, so I will end the meeting. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and contributing this afternoon. I think some really rich conversations have happened, which is really good and really productive. Have a good half term, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all in person at County Hall just before Christmas. The clerk will now end the recording of the meeting and indicate when this has been completed. If you could stay online, mute your microphone and remain silent until the confirmation has been received. Thank you.